Good evening and welcome. Tonight we delve into one of the most complex and vigorously debated issues at the intersection of sports, science, and human rights. Should transgender athletes be permitted to compete in categories aligning with their affirmed gender identity? This is a conversation fraught with deeply held beliefs, touching upon fundamental questions of fairness, inclusion, and the very definition of categories within competitive sport. The stakes are undeniably high for athletes, governing bodies, and society at large. Joining us to navigate this multifaceted terrain are two distinguished guests with differing perspectives. Dr. Evelyn Reed, a renowned sports sociologist and human rights advocate, argues passionately for inclusion. And Marcus Cole, a former professional athlete and respected sports commentator, raises concerns regarding physiological differences and competitive equity. We'll begin with opening statements, followed by a moderated discussion, and conclude with closing remarks. Our aim tonight is not necessarily consensus, but rather a respectful, evidence-informed exploration of the divergent viewpoints. Dr. Reed, please begin.
Thank you, Alex. At its core, this debate hinges on fundamental principles of human dignity and the right to participate fully in society, which unequivocally includes sport. To deny transgender individuals the opportunity to compete according to their affirmed gender identity constitutes a profound form of discrimination. We must move beyond outdated notions of biological essentialism. Gender identity is a deeply intrinsic aspect of self, not a whim or a choice. Furthermore, biological sex itself is far more complex than a simple binary allows, encompassing chromosomal, hormonal, and anatomical variations. Crucially, the physiological effects of gender-affirming hormone therapy are significant. Treatments involving testosterone suppression for transgender women substantially alter body composition, muscle mass, and hemoglobin levels, key factors influencing athletic performance. While the science is continually evolving, existing data suggests that any residual advantages are often mitigated and certainly do not warrant a blanket exclusion. Many governing bodies, including the IOC and various international federations, have already established frameworks, however imperfect, allowing participation under specific conditions. This demonstrates a recognition that inclusion is achievable. We must resist policies rooted in fear or prejudice, and instead embrace evidence-based approaches that allow for individual assessment where necessary. Policies should focus on fostering inclusive environments that uphold the rights of all athletes, rather than erecting barriers based on generalizations. The goal should be meaningful participation, acknowledging that sport is about more than just winning. It's about belonging, self-expression, and personal growth.
Thank you, Dr. Reed. Mr. Cole, your opening statement.
Thank you, Alex. While I wholeheartedly support the rights and societal inclusion of transgender individuals, the specific context of elite competitive sport demands a different, more nuanced consideration. We cannot disregard the inherent physiological dimorphism between biological males and females, particularly the advantages conferred by male puberty. These include, on average, greater bone density, larger skeletal structure, increased muscle mass potential, higher lung capacity, and cardiovascular advantages. Current hormone suppression protocols, typically requiring testosterone levels below a certain threshold for a year or more, do induce changes. However, compelling evidence suggests they do not fully reverse the performance-enhancing effects of male puberty. Retained advantages in strength, speed, and endurance often persist, creating an uneven playing field. The women's sports category was specifically established to provide a protected space for biological females to compete fairly against their peers, counteracting precisely these male physiological advantages. Allowing transgender women, who have experienced male puberty, to compete in the female category potentially compromises the integrity of that competition and risks displacing cisgender female athletes from achieving podium finishes, earning scholarships, or even participating. Furthermore, The adequacy and verifiability of current regulations, such as testosterone monitoring, are questionable. Ensuring compliance consistently across all levels of sport presents significant logistical and ethical challenges. We must prioritize competitive equity and the preservation of meaningful opportunities for biological females in sport.
Thank you both for laying out your positions so clearly. Let's move into our discussion phase. Mr. Cole, you highlighted retained physiological advantages. How do you quantify what constitutes a significant or material advantage, especially considering this varies considerably across different sports? Say archery versus rugby.
That's a pertinent question, Alex. Quantifying it precisely across all disciplines is indeed challenging. However, we look at performance gaps between elite male and female athletes in sports heavily reliant on strength, power, and speed, typically ranging from 10% to upwards of 30% or more. Even if hormone therapy reduces this gap, studies suggest a significant portion of the advantage, particularly relating to skeletal structure and muscle memory, remains. In sports like weightlifting, athletics, or contact sports like rugby, even a few percentage points difference is competitively decisive. The principle isn't about guaranteeing identical outcomes, but ensuring the potential for fair competition isn't fundamentally undermined by insurmountable biological disparities stemming from male developmental pathways.
Dr. Reed, how do you respond to the assertion that current hormone suppression protocols are insufficient to level the playing field, particularly concerning advantages gained during male puberty that might be irreversible?
Marcus raises valid points about physiological differences, but the narrative often oversimplifies the impact of hormone therapy and ignores other variables. Firstly, the reduction in muscle mass and strength in transgender women undergoing therapy is substantial and well documented. While some structural differences may persist, their direct translation into a, quote, material advantage across all sports isn't a given. Performance is multifactorial. Technique, training, psychology, resources, and coaching play enormous roles. Focusing solely on puberty-derived biology ignores this complexity. Furthermore, the research landscape is evolving. Much of the data cited is based on limited sample sizes or doesn't adequately control for training levels pre- and post-transition. We need more longitudinal studies, but the absence of definitive proof of *no advantage shouldn't automatically default to exclusion. Existing regulations, like the 12-month testosterone suppression rule used by many bodies, represent a pragmatic attempt to balance inclusion and fairness based on available science. Is it perfect? Likely not, but it's a starting point, preferable to outright bans.
Mr. Cole, Dr. Reed mentions the multifactorial nature of performance. How much weight should be given to innate biological factors versus factors like training, resources, and psychological drive, which also create disparities among cisgender athletes?
Of course, training, resources, and mentality are critical components of success for any athlete. Disparities exist even among cisgender women due to genetics and opportunities. However, the specific advantages conferred by male puberty represent a different category of advantage. It establishes a fundamentally different physiological baseline, particularly in strength and power metrics. While a cisgender woman might overcome resource limitations through exceptional talent and drive, overcoming the average baseline physiological differences established by male puberty presents a far greater, often insurmountable, hurdle in many sports. We categorize sport by sex precisely because these baseline differences are so significant on average. To ignore that foundational principle specifically for transgender women seems inconsistent if the goal is maintaining competitive balance within the female category.
Dr. Reed, Mr. Cole frames this as maintaining the integrity of a category established to counteract male physiological advantage. How do you reconcile the principle of inclusion with the stated purpose of the women's category?
The purpose of the women's category is indeed to ensure meaningful competition for women. However, transgender women tar selbstständige women. Excluding them perpetuates the harmful idea that their identity is less valid, or that they somehow don't belong in the category that aligns with their gender. Rather than viewing inclusion as a threat, we should see it as an evolution of our understanding. The concept of, quote, fairness itself warrants scrutiny. Is the current system perfectly fair even among cisgender women, given natural biological variations? Elite sport is inherently about leveraging advantages, whether genetic, environmental, or technological. Focusing solely on the potential advantages of transgender women while ignoring others seems disproportionate and potentially discriminatory. Perhaps the conversation needs to shift towards how we can adapt sporting structures to be more inclusive while still managing competitive balance, potentially through nuanced, sport-specific regulations based on performance metrics or longer transition periods, rather than categorical exclusion.
You both acknowledge the limitations in current long-term data regarding transgender athletes' performance post-transition under regulation. Mr. Cole, given this uncertainty, why advocate for potentially exclusionary policies now rather than allowing more data to accumulate under current inclusive frameworks?
Because the potential costs of waiting could be the irreversible loss of opportunities and records for cisgender female athletes. While we await more comprehensive data, the existing physiological knowledge strongly suggests a retained advantage in many cases. Acting with caution, prioritizing the established framework for female competition seems prudent. It's not about permanent exclusion, necessarily, but about ensuring the competitive balance isn't fundamentally disrupted based on policies derived from incomplete data. Perhaps more rigorous, sport-specific research is needed now before widespread implementation of inclusive policies at the elite level, especially in power and endurance sports. The burden of proof, arguably, should lie in demonstrating that inclusion doesn't compromise fairness, rather than the reverse.
Dr. Reed, what about the practical challenges and potential for manipulation? Concerns are often raised about the difficulty of verifying hormone levels consistently and globally, and the potential, however small, for individuals to misuse the system for competitive gain.
Concerns about cheating exist in all areas of sport. Doping is a prime example. We don't ban entire categories of athletes because some might cheat. We implement testing protocols and sanctions. The same principle should apply here. Developing robust and fair testing mechanisms is a challenge for governing bodies, but it's not an insurmountable one. To use potential logistical hurdles, or the hypothetical actions of a few bad actors as a reason to deny participation rights to an entire group is unjust. Furthermore, the idea that individuals would undergo complex medical transitions, often involving significant personal, social, and financial costs, merely for a potential edge in sport is largely unfounded speculation. It trivializes the profound reality of gender dysphoria and transition.
Let's briefly touch upon alternative solutions. Some propose open categories alongside male and female ones. Mr. Cole, do you see this as a viable path forward?
An open category could be a potential avenue to explore, theoretically allowing anyone to compete regardless of gender identity or sex, perhaps alongside the existing male and female categories. It might offer a space for inclusion without impacting the female category directly. However, its implementation raises many questions. Would it attract sufficient participation to be meaningful? Would it inadvertently marginalize transgender athletes further? And critically, it doesn't resolve the core question for transgender women who identify with and wish to compete in the asterisk female category. It might be part of a future solution, but I don't believe it fully addresses the complexities we're discussing tonight, particularly regarding the desire for inclusion within existing gendered structures.
Dr. Reed, your perspective on open categories or other structural alternatives?
While I appreciate the intent behind exploring alternatives like open categories, they risk reinforcing the idea that transgender women aren't, quote, real women, essentially creating a separate, othered category. This runs counter to the principle of affirming gender identity. The focus, in my view, should remain on adapting the existing structures, male and female categories, to be inclusive, based on the best available science and principles of non-discrimination. This might involve sport-specific adjustments to eligibility criteria, potentially moving beyond solely testosterone levels. Perhaps incorporating assessments of specific performance metrics relevant to that sport could offer a more nuanced approach, though that too presents significant challenges. Ultimately, solutions must affirm identity, not create new forms of segregation.
One final point before closing statements. Dr. Reed, you frame this primarily as a human rights issue. Mr. Cole, you frame it primarily as an issue of competitive fairness within a specific structure. How do we balance these potentially conflicting frames?
It's a false dichotomy to pit human rights against fairness. True fairness must encompass human rights. A system that structurally excludes a group based on their identity cannot be considered genuinely fair. The challenge is to find regulatory mechanisms that respect identity and mitigate any demonstrated significant competitive imbalances to a degree acceptable within the norms of that specific sport. It requires nuance, ongoing research, and a commitment to inclusion.
I agree it's not necessarily a direct conflict, but there's undeniable tension. While respecting identity is paramount in society, the specific structure of sport, particularly the female category, was created for a reason rooted in biology. Balancing these requires acknowledging that the inclusion of athletes with male puberty-derived advantages into the female category inherently challenges the original purpose of that category. Finding a balance might mean accepting that perfect inclusion within the current structure might not be possible without compromising competitive equity in some sports. This might lead us back to considering structural changes or accepting that some regulations might feel exclusionary to some while protective to others. There are no easy answers, but we must be honest about the physiological realities involved in sport.
Thank you both for that insightful exchange. We now move to closing statements. Mr. Cole, you have the floor.
Thank you. Tonight we've explored a deeply complex issue. While the drive for inclusion is understandable and laudable in a societal context, we must exercise caution when applying it wholesale to the unique environment of competitive sport. The biological advantages conferred by male puberty, advantages in strength, power, and endurance, are significant and, according to current evidence, not fully negated by hormone suppression. These are not minor variations, they are fundamental physiological differences. The women's sports category exists specifically to provide a space where biological females can compete fairly, shielded from these inherent male advantages. To allow transgender women who have undergone male puberty into this category risks undermining the very foundation of fair play and meaningful competition for cisgender women. We risk displacing dedicated female athletes, skewing results, and potentially discouraging female participation. While more research is ongoing, the potential detriment to women's sport demands a cautious approach. Protecting the integrity and purpose of the women's category must remain a priority. This may involve maintaining stricter eligibility criteria based on biological sex for competitive fairness, or seriously investigating alternative structures like open categories until such time as science can definitively demonstrate that competitive equity is maintained. This isn't about denying identity, but about preserving the specific conditions necessary for fair athletic competition for biological females.
Thank you, Mr. Cole. Dr. Reed, your closing statement.
Thank you. Participation in sport is a fundamental aspect of human expression and well-being, intrinsically linked to dignity and rights. Excluding transgender athletes from competing in accordance with their affirmed gender identity is discriminatory and causes profound harm. Transgender women are women. Basing policy on fear, prejudice, or an oversimplified understanding of biology ignores the significant physiological changes induced by hormone therapy and the multifactorial nature of athletic success. While legitimate questions about competitive balance exist, these should be addressed through nuanced, evidence-based policies, individual assessments where appropriate, and sport-specific regulations, not through blanket bans that deny fundamental rights. The science is evolving, and sporting bodies must evolve with it. We must move away from biological essentialism towards frameworks that recognize gender identity and strive for inclusion. Creating inclusive sporting environments benefits everyone, fostering understanding and acceptance. The challenge is not insurmountable. It requires courage, commitment to ongoing research, and a willingness to adapt structures to uphold both fairness and the human rights of all athletes. Let us strive for an evolution in sport that embraces equity and celebrates participation, ensuring no one is left behind simply because of who they are. Human dignity must be the guiding principle.
Dr. Reed, Mr. Cole, thank you both for sharing your expertise and perspectives with such clarity and conviction on this exceptionally challenging topic. Your contributions have undoubtedly deepened our understanding of the intricate issues involved.